Hi, my name is Adrian Zierenberg, and today I want to share some of my experiences as a flight instructor with you. So the reason why I'm making this video now is simply because I was looking for a video which explains what I found out to be some of the root causes of struggling during flight training, and I couldn't really find something that brought it to the point which I would like to make. So I simply bought the camera and thought, why not make an own video. So short story about my background. I was an airline pilot for about 8 to 9 years, flying Boeing 737 and other smaller turboprop airplane, and then I decided to become a flight instructor and worked for about 10 years as a flight instructor in several roles. And what I found out is most of the students that struggled during the training, they really struggled with the same things, even though they had different difficulties. Usually you could just look at the issue and then find the root cause, and usually it was just simply the same thing from student to student. And when I found this out, it was really simple to just use a half an hour during a pre-flight briefing and improve the flying skills of the students really fast. So let's start. The first thing is that you really need to understand the basics of pitch and power. And the other thing is that you understand attitude flying. For to jump right into it, I know there are a lot of discussions about pitch and power, and it's more likely it will be some discussions about this video and what I'm about to teach you now. But I think I will just give you my version of it, my version which helped to improve the flying skills of a lot of students. And even though it might not be the most correct one, it is one that works, and that's the most important for me. So let's start. What I usually teach is that you pitch your aircraft for speed, and you use power for altitude. And I know these two things are connected to each other, but if you just separate it a little bit, it's easier to understand. So what I mean with this is, let's assume you're flying straight and level with 100 knots, and now you start to pitch up your aircraft. You simply pull the stick, pitch up the aircraft. The main thing that happens now is your aircraft will slow down. But if you slow down, your aircraft needs less energy to stay at the altitude you are just flying. So the second thing that happens while you're pitching up, the aircraft starts to climb, because it just wants to get rid of the excessive energy that you're not using for your airspeed. Let's now say you're flying straight and level with 100 knots, and now you're pitching down. What happens is you will start to accelerate. And to accelerate, you need more energy. So the aircraft, because you didn't add any power, the aircraft just starts to use altitude and convert it into speed. So pitch up, we're slowing down, pitch down, we're accelerating. And each time the excessive or missing energy will be used from altitude or converted into altitude. So you're simply just shifting the energy within the airplane. And now let's see, if you pitch for your airspeed and you pitch with the elevator and you trim is positioned at the elevator, this means your trim is choosing an airspeed. So you're not trimming the airplane for an altitude, you're trimming the airplane for a speed. So when we are flying straight and level with 100 knots and you don't need to touch your controls because you trimmed correctly, means you have trimmed for 100 knots. Let's come to the second point. Power is altitude. If you fly straight and level with 100 knots, you have trimmed your airplane and now you add some power. This means now you added some energy. What the airplane will do quite rapidly is start to climb, because you trimmed your airplane for 100 knots. Means you add energy, the airplane maybe for half a second or a second will start to accelerate, and right away the trim will start to work and pitch your airplane up in order to maintain the 100 knots. And now you start to climb, and the more power you add, the more the aircraft will start to climb. If you really adjust the power quite rapidly, so it means you're going to from half power, 50% power to 100% power, it might be quite an overreaction. So the aircraft will start to pitch up, it will most likely overreact, pitch up too much. The trim will then discover that you're flying too slow, so you will start to pitch down a little bit until you're a little bit too fast, and then too slow, too fast, too slow, and at the end you will end up at around about 100 knots but climbing. So the same is applying for if you are reducing power. Let's say you just fly 100 knots straight and level, and now you pull the throttle back. Immediately the aircraft starts to pitch down. The trim wants to regain the 100 knots or maintain the 100 knots, and now you're just simply losing altitude and the aircraft will maintain 100 knots. Okay, now let's go through some exercises. Let's assume you just want to change your airspeed while flying straight and level. You're flying at your chosen altitude, you're flying with 100 knots, and now you want to accelerate, but you also want to stay at your altitude. So what you're doing is you just adding power, means adding altitude, and then you are converting it with the pitch into speed. It means you add power, the airplane right away starts to climb, but you just override with pushing the stick forward and converting your excessive climb energy into speed. That means the more you're leaving, or the more distance you have between the airspeed that you have trimmed, let's say the 100 knots, now you are 110, 120, 130, the more distance you have between your trimmed airspeed and your actual airspeed, the more force you have to overcome on your stick. So you are adding throttle, airplane starts to climb because you added power, you gain altitude, you pitch down and convert your excessive climb energy into speed, like a surfer on a wave. You're just surfing on the power wave now. And while you're accelerating, as I told you, you have to overcome the force on the stick, which is caused by the trim trying to get back to the 100 knots. So while you're doing this, you can start trimming forward, and you just need to find out where to stop the additional power, reduce the throttle until you have established the airspeed that you want to keep and the altitude you want to keep. And now you simply trim the airplane for the new airspeed, and you will now, let's say, fly straight and level, same altitude you had before, but with 120 knots, and you have added some extra power. The same applies for the reduction of airspeed. You want to fly slower than 100 knots. The first thing you're doing, reduce power. So initiate and descent. but now you convert this descent into slower airspeed. So the aircraft starts to pitch down, and immediately you pull the throttle, the stick back, maintain your altitude while slowing the aircraft down. And the more distance you have between your actual airspeed and your trimmed airspeed, the more you have to pull on the throttle in order to keep the attitude where it is right now. And then you start to trim until you really don't need to touch the stick anymore, and the aircraft is flying the airspeed you want to fly. Okay, let's talk about the next step, which is change of altitude. And it's actually one of the easiest things you can do, and it's one of the first things you do during your flight training, but funny enough, it's one of the things a lot of pilots are struggling with, even after the flight training. So let's assume, again, you're flying straight and level with 100 knots, and now you just want to climb 1000 feet above. As we learned, power is altitude. What you just do, you add power, the aircraft starts to climb right away because the trim just wants to keep the airplane at 100 knots, but you have additional energy. Aircraft starts to climb. As I told you, it will most probably, the more aggressive your power change is, the more aggressive the overreaction will be. So the trim just slows down too much, then it pitches down again, and it will be too much airspeed, not enough airspeed, too much, and so on. You just start to oscillate around your flight path, and at the end you will be established on a nice steady flight path with the same airspeed to 100 knots, and you just climbing. The more power you add, you higher your climb rate. When you reach your altitude of desire, you simply reduce the airspeed back to the same value that you had before. So if you had 70% engine power, you added power to climb, you just reduce to 70%, and the trim will do its work. It will just keep the 100 knots, and the power is exactly the value that you need to stay with the 100 knots at the altitude. The same applies for a descent. You fly straight and level, you want to descend 1000 feet. You reduce the power, the airplane starts to pitch down. Most probably it will overreact and dive down too much, pitch a little bit up, and starts to oscillate until it is established on a smooth and nice descent path. And when you reach the altitude you want to maintain, it's there where a lot of pilots are struggling. What they're doing now is they just pull the stick back in order to maintain the altitude. So they had, let's say, 70% power reduced to 50% power, reaching the next altitude, keeping the 50% power, and now pulling the stick backwards. What happens now is you pitch your airplane, that means you use your speed and convert it into altitude. So you will most probably stay at your altitude that you want to stay at, but your airspeed is decreasing constantly. While your airspeed is decreasing, you feel a stick force, you feel that the trim wants to get the nose down in order to maintain your 100 knots, but you're flying slower, so you maybe start to trim the airplane to slower airspeed until you figure out that you're losing your airspeed. And now what you're doing is add power, and right away, because you not trimmed your airplane to a slow airspeed, it starts to climb. What you're doing now is push the stick forward in order to get my speed. And now you're just struggling, you're just making a mess. It takes a long time to overcome all of this. And the simple thing you could just do is reduce the power, descend, and then when reaching the altitude you want to stay at, give the power back. Simply give the aircraft, let's say, the 70% power, and it will just on itself level off and fly, and you have all the time to do other stuff. Okay, let's sum up everything we just learned. Again, you pitch your aircraft for airspeed and you reduce or add power to change your altitude. And of course, these two things are connected. But if you just, as I said, separate it a little bit, it is easier to understand. Pitch your aircraft, slow down, accelerate, add power, you climb and you descend. You want to stay at the level, but accelerate, add altitude, convert into speed, reduce altitude, convert into slower airspeed. If you want to change your altitude at the same airspeed, give it some throttle, the airplane will start to climb, then reduce to the amount you had before, and the aircraft just simply levels off. Or you want to descend, reduce the power, the airplane starts to descend, and when you reach your altitude, you simply add the power that you took away. Just give it back to the airplane, and it will just level off. Simple as that. The next thing, I think the attitude flying, which is still a part of this, but it's even a bigger part during IFR flying. I will just make another video as part number 2, and we'll be back.